pleased to be a co-sponsor here of the summit this year with my GliaNet Alliance, and I'll talk about what that means and why we need a governance layer on top of all the amazing technology that we've been talking about earlier this afternoon. So Matt briefly mentioned a book. I did in fact write a book last fall based in part on my 12 years of experience at Google, defending the company, as it turns out, mostly incorrectly from those who were asserting that it was violating privacy and basic human agency and autonomy in the world. So Reweaving the Web, it's actually going to be tomorrow. We have the booth, what is it, 112? Over in the Scale 22. I'll be signing books and selling them, but all the proceeds will go to Quai, so 100%. So if you want to give some money to Quai, come by, get a book, give money to a wonderful cause. So what's this GliaNet thing? So I talk about in the book a little bit. I focus a bit on the challenges of the web, but one of my assertions is that we spend way too much time talking about the problems and not having specific solutions. And as a lawyer, that really bugs the hell out of me. So, you know, this is what I come up with is sort of the overarching thematic of what's wrong with the web in the last 20 years. I call it the seams paradigm, surveillance, extraction, analysis, manipulation. Nothing really new here. It's based on Shoshana Zuboff and lots of other amazing folks who have done this analysis. I've actually talked to the people at the companies doing all of this, and it's all very clear. Even the term manipulation, which I first came up with 7, 8 years ago, some people thought that was a tad strong. Now I think it's actually right on point, if not even in the age of AI, underselling it a bit. So glia is the ancient Greek word for glue. And I chose it for my project for a couple of reasons. One is, and we've talked about it a number of times here this afternoon, and it's the word that keeps coming up over and over again, it's trust. And in fact, this notion that we have a lack of trust in society between individuals and companies, our political systems, all of that, right? Our communities of interest. And trust is the social glue that does in fact hold us together. The web did not create that problem, but it has certainly exacerbated it. And so one of the things I'm hoping to do with my project is build authentic human trust into the way that we govern advanced technology systems, including, of course, AI. There's also this notion of accountability. In Spider-Man, Uncle Ben tells the young Peter Parker, right before Uncle Ben gets offed, that with great power comes great responsibility. Those who have the power, of course, don't want the responsibility, so in that case, the glue has come asunder. We need to sort of build that accountability back into the system somehow. And then finally, the glial cells in the brain. A really interesting story. Those cells actually, in the late 19th century, when they first did the scans of the cranium, they could see all the neurons because their electrical signals are going very rapidly. And then they saw the stuff in between that looked like it was inert. And they said, well, this isn't doing anything. It must be gluing the neurons together, so we'll use the term glial. As it turns out, glial cells work on chemicals, not on electrical signals, and therefore were not showing up in the brain scans. And in fact, they do an amazing amount of things to promote, enhance, and protect the neural systems. So I like that notion of having sort of a human support system behind all of the things happening with the neural structures that we're building in the AI systems. I also like to say, since I'm from Silicon Valley, you go to a typical, happy hour, there's tons of neural networks everywhere. There's very few glials sort of standing around, holding a gin and tonic. So I think we need a bunch more of this going forward. So I basically have this notion of what I call a layered trust fabric, and this is just the multiple elements that make up sort of a typical sort of ecosystem approach. And again, as a lawyer, governance to me sort of go on the top. Governance is basically just the rules of the road, right? You can talk about laws and regulations and constitutional amendments at the very highest level. Those are like the strongest forms of governance in the public sector. And then you have the private sector, which tend to be things like terms of service, right? APIs are a good example of governance in a sense. We don't think about it that way often, but these are typically unilaterally published by a company. We then utilize it, and then if the company decides the next day they want to change it, they can, and they do. And so that is a form of governance. And then of course we have markets, we have technology, and then we have the public policy side of it, which is how do you change the rules of the road, both in the public sector and perhaps for the private sector as well. Matt mentioned net fiduciary. This is the core, sort of the core ingredient that I came up with in my years of thinking about this, first at Google and then at the Mozilla Foundation. We have fiduciaries in our lives today, right? We have doctors, we have lawyers, financial advisors, even librarians have a certain fiduciary duty towards us. When we check out a book, they don't share those records with the government, right? And it's this idea that goes back to hundreds of years of the common law, but the underlying premise of this, and many scholars have talked about it and written about it, is the notion of a power asymmetry. So if somebody has an expertise that I lack, you're creating right there an imbalance between the two of us. If I have to share confidences with you in order for you to utilize your expertise to make my life better, that deepens or exacerbates that power asymmetry. And so we have these situations. We have, over the years as a society, in the medical profession, the legal profession, and elsewhere, decided there should be fiduciary duties that apply that come from the common law. And I'll go to the basics in a second. But the idea here is we had this in the 20th century, essentially, in the early 21st century, in the analog world around us. We have nothing like that on the web. And yet I would argue that the data that we are providing, surreptitiously or otherwise, to the platforms, now the AI agents that want to probe deeply into our psychology in order to understand us and do things for us, we in fact have a greater power asymmetry than at really any other point that I can think of, going back again through the hundreds of years of the history of these professions and the like. So my belief is we need to have a new sector, perhaps even a new profession, of entities and individuals who are net fiduciaries. So here's a framework that I came up with that tries to map this to the particular kind of role, and then an example that I think we could all hopefully understand and appreciate from the web. So the three basics here are protect, enhance, and promote. The lowest level, protect, is the basic duty of care, which in fact shows up in a number of statutes around the world for basic industries. So you do something to somebody, the basic notion is no harm. Whatever you're doing, don't harm me. Seems pretty low level, but it is a pretty important premise, right? If there are companies operating out there, and of course many are, who don't have that basic obligation, they can do whatever they want to, even if there's objectively harm that's being caused to you or your community. And so, as the web example there, it's pretty straightforward. Again, strengthening your personal data, putting up a moat around me if I want one, right? To protect my data, keep it safe, put it in a solid pod in my living room, so Tim Berners-Lee will be pleased that he finally figured out a way to try to rectify the errors of the web. That's sort of the lowest level. The middle level is an enhance function, and for that I call that a mediator. So somebody sort of acting to mediate for you on your behalf with the web. And the example I use there is news feeds. If I want to set up an algorithm that says these are the 20 news sources I find the most relevant to me, I should have the right to do that. And this entity would help me to do that in ways consistent with what I want. And then the highest level is promote. And that is the idea of an advocate of loyalty. The duty of loyalty is the strongest. That's to promote my best interests. That's what doctors and lawyers, by professional code and conduct, are bound to do for us, with few exceptions. And this comes back to intent casting. So we had Doc Searles on earlier. He's been a great supporter of this idea of intent casting myself into the web. A particular example is shopping. His wife Joyce has talked about the universal shopping cart. Why can't I take my cart to the websites, do my shopping perhaps in a synonymous manner in ways that fulfill my needs, but without sharing, spreading my data? My intentionality is all over the web. And so this is just one example, pairing the idea of a net fiduciary with an edge-based technology. The one we've been talking about, of course, this afternoon is the authentic personal AI agent, which then in turn interacts with what I call institutional AIs. So Doc calls them corporate AIs, I call them institutional, but it's the same notion. The ones over there on the right want us to believe, per Bruce Schneier, that they are our friends. And in fact, as Bruce very well lays out, they are double agents. They're not really acting on our behalf. And so if we have an agent that in fact abides by duties of care and loyalty to me under the auspices of a net fiduciary, then you are in fact, you have both the technology and the governance on your side to help try to right some of that power imbalance. How much longer? Okay. So this is a proposed theory of change, and I'll just go through I'll go through these slides very quickly because I could love to talk more about this at the panel, and then if you see me all tomorrow at the book signing. But the theory of change is within the next 6, 7, 8 years, there's no reason we can't have 50 million people in the United States who are served by a net fiduciary and 50 million people utilizing these kinds of agents. Some people says that sounds crazy. Some people say it sounds woefully underwhelming. But I think looking at it in terms of the different elements I laid out earlier, right? The private governance, designing the technology, public governance, and the social fabric, which is in some ways the most important, which is convincing the ordinary person that their expectations are way too low. And then in fact, the platform companies have done a wonderful job of telling us, you have no privacy, forget about it, give up, it's useless. And now the AIs are going to build on top of all of that when in fact, it's the exact opposite. We're now opening up a huge world of opportunity and potential, and the average person needs to be excited about that. And so my GliaNet Alliance, so-called Coalition of the Willing, so far we have 20 companies in the mix. Very pleased to have Kwai there as one of the inaugural members, as well as Personal.ai and Cryptid, who you heard from, some of you heard from this morning across the way. And it's attempting to look at each of these 4 different layers and building out what we call a community of practice. So understanding what is an ethical business model, right? What's a privacy policy where the first sentence says, it's your data, not mine, right? I mean, these are like different ways of putting governance into the world, as well as, again, the business models themselves and the technologies and all of that. We have a statement of principles, again, nothing too earth-shattering there, it's just acknowledging the current problems with the web and a desire of these different, mostly smaller startups to work together to explore becoming essentially net fiduciaries in the world. Our provisional roadmap, we're over there now on phase 3, which is working groups to look at each of those different components over time, moving towards phase 4, which is moving essentially from a community of practice to a community of practitioners, whether that means having a licensing, certification, trust marks, back-end enforcement regimes, all that to be decided. One quick thing I'll mention, and then we can move to the panel. The 2 dimensions of AI agency, and again, we've sort of talked about it a bit today, but I want to put a slightly finer point on it. Agency, or the notion of an agent, has 2 definitions, or 2 aspects of the definition. The one that OpenAI wants us to always focus on is the agenticity, the agenticness, and that's what we hear all the time, agenticity. That's about taking actions in the world, making decisions, doing advanced stuff on behalf of somebody, but the on behalf of somebody is the part that tends to get missed. And so I call that agentiality, it's another adverb, but the notion there is that it has to be something authorized by the actual human being. Somebody mentioned Clippy earlier, so this is one way to think about it. As we move into more agentic capabilities, from bots to assistants, all the way up to eventually autonomous agents, right, acting ostensibly for us, we need to also, on the relationship side, move from just being a mere user to having a duty of care, ultimately to duty of loyalty. So again, with more power, more responsibility. Poor Clippy there, of course, was just he was an annoyance more than anything else back in the 90s. But his brethren are going to be out there and already are out there very soon. This is ecosystem mapping of our membership. This is the leadership. And I thank you all. And if you're interested in joining the Alliance, please come talk to me. Thanks.